Skylark Outdoors here, and today we're going to go over 3 reasons that I prefer outboard engines over inboard engines. Now, the number one reason that I prefer outboard engines over inboard engines is less maintenance. Now, in general, they are going to have similar maintenance, but there's a couple things on an outboard that make it much easier to maintain for the average boater. The first one is the winterization process for most outboards. If you've got an outboard engine, and especially if you live in a northern climate where you're exposed to freezing temperatures, you can pretty much take an outboard boat with an outboard engine, pull it off the boat ramp, let the water drain out in 20 or 30 seconds from the cooling system, and you are good to go. You don't have to worry about your boat having any kind of freezing within the engine, potentially ruining and damaging the engine. With an inboard boat, well, when you've got colder temperatures where you could have potentially freezing temperatures, you can absolutely crack an engine block if there's any water left in that system, and you typically need to winterize those. Now, in terms of typical maintenance like spark plugs and changing the oils, both of these engines are pretty similar. However, inboard engines paired with stern drives do have a couple more maintenance items that people might not be aware of when compared to an outboard engine. And some of those maintenance items are what's called a bellows, which is the rubberized gasket system, which basically connects the stern drive shaft to the back of the boat. And those over time just go bad, usually every 1 to 5 years, depending on your climate, depending on your usage, depending on how you store it. And if you're in saltwater or freshwater, and if you're hot or cold, they're gonna last a longer time. So I'm just giving a range of 1 to 5 years, but that is a wear item that needs to be replaced fairly regularly, where you don't have that with an outboard engine, because everything in the outboard engine, the transmission and all that, is all contained in that one unit. There is no bellows that needs to be replaced. In terms of maintenance for the impellers, an outboard engine and an inboard engine typically have very similar impeller replacement schedules, so there's not much difference there. But the bellows system and the other things like the shift cable bellows and exhaust bellows, those all will need to be replaced on an inboard engine with an outdrive or stern drive versus an outboard engine where you don't have any of those components. Number 2, and this kind of goes a little bit along with maintenance again, but the outboard engines are much more comfortable to maintain. You don't have to be down in a dirty, small, cramped engine compartment to change the oil on your outboard engine. Everything is just out there on the back of the boat. If you've got it on a trailer, very simple to access most things. Maybe you need a step ladder, but you're still outside. And if you're in a hot climate, it is so much nicer to be outside the boat rather than a cramped, tiny little engine room working on something, as well as you've got all the natural light to be able to see what you're doing. And a lot of times engine rooms just don't have good light. They're cramped, they're tight. They've got water that's been in there for a long time. They just stink and they're gross. And if you've worked on an inboard engine in a tiny little cramped engine room, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And it is a major disadvantage. And typically it seems like if you're getting your boat serviced even at a dealer or something like that, dealers and techs will typically take more labor to work on an inboard engine than an outboard engine, because it's just harder to access. There's more difficulties getting tools there, more difficulties getting parts there. You may have to take other things apart to get access, versus with the outboard engine, everything is right there and very easily accessible and easy to check on as well, and you can see what's going on. Now, the third reason that I like outboard engines more than inboard engines is typically they have a higher power to rate ratio than inboard engines, which means that you're going to get more out of every pound of your engine that you've got on your outboard engine than if you've got an inboard engine. There's just more systems built around an inboard engine that add to the weight of it, and a lot of inboard engines are typically just repurposed V6s, V8s, and inline 4 engines from the automotive industry that may have a little bit different boring, maybe a little bit different cam, and a little bit different setup. However, those engines were primarily designed around automotive use, so they're heavier than an outboard engine typically is, as well as most of them will have a stern drive on the back, which adds weight, whereas that is all just one component with an outboard engine. So pound for pound, typically you're getting more power to weight ratio out of an outboard engine versus an inboard engine, which typically means better performance and better fuel economy with a similar sized outboard engine versus an inboard engine. Now that we've gone over the three things that I prefer on an outboard engine versus an inboard engine, what are some additional things just to consider if you're looking at a boat with an inboard or an outboard engine? If you are in saltwater, an outboard engine typically seems to be the much better choice, and that's because they're much easier to flush the salt water out of typically than an inboard engine. Most outboards these days are going to have a quick connect plug where you just plug a hose in, you run that through the outboard engine when you're done for the day, and that's going to flush a lot of that salt out of the engine to prolong the life and longevity of all your system components on that engine, versus an inboard engine where you really typically can't flush the entire system. You may have a closed cooling system and they're separated with a heat exchanger. However, the components that are exposed to salt water up to the heat exchanger are still going to have corrosion issues with that inboard engine, which is a problem that you typically don't experience with outboard engines. So that is another thought on it. Now, where is the advantage of an inboard engine? Typically, boats with inboard engines have a quicker depreciation, which means a lower price point if you're buying a boat used than an outboard engine boat. Typically, outboards seem to hold their price more because there are outboards that people take off of the existing boat when they repower, and then they sell those on a secondary market. So there is some value typically, even in the outboard engine itself, when you've got it and you want to repower, versus an inboard engine. Not many people are going to go through the work to take an entire inboard engine, all the components off, and then resell that block when they repower. Versus with an outboard, sometimes people repower just because they want more horsepower, they want more fuel efficiency, or they want to change everything around on the setup of their boat. So you've got a secondary market for outboard engines, which tend to have a higher value. Typically, they are lower maintenance, so that leads to a higher value because you are spending typically less money on maintaining it, versus an inboard engine, which just every year you're going to be spending a little bit more money to maintain it versus an outboard engine. So that is another thing to consider. Typically, if you're looking at a boat, and especially used boats, a boat with an inboard engine, if there's a similar model that has an outboard engine, the inboard engine model is typically going to be priced a little bit lower because it does depreciate faster. There's not really much of a secondary market for inboard engines, and the maintenance over time is typically more on an inboard engine than you're going to have on an outboard. So just a couple things to consider there. So thanks for watching this video. We hope you enjoyed it, and please subscribe or check the description below if you want to learn more about boating, become a better boater, or learn more about the outdoors. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.